Okay, our next petition this morning is PE 1597 by Bill Welsh on mycoplasma fermentans in regressive autism. Members have a note from the clerks, the petition itself and the SPICE briefing on the issue. And this morning, Mr Welsh is joined by his constituency MSP, Ken McIntosh, who I'll give an opportunity to make a contribution at some point after we hear from Mr Welsh. We have a few minutes to introduce the petition. Mr Welsh, over to you, and then we'll discuss the issues that you've raised with us.
Good morning.
Morning.
And thanks very much for inviting me to contribute to this Petitions Committee. I have actually been here 3 times before, always on the same subject or general subject, autism, and the relationship of MMR vaccine to autism. From 1998 to about 2005, thousands of parents marched, protested, campaigned in the UK and other countries regarding their child's withdrawal, gradual withdrawal into autistic spectrum disorder following vaccination, particularly the MMR vaccine. As honorary president of a Scottish autism charity, I was personally involved in 5 marches in this city, Edinburgh, 1 march in Glasgow, and a very big event in London, in which over 10,000 parents attended. At the end of that march, 6 of us were invited into 11 Downing Street, myself and 5 mothers of autistic children. Alistair Darling asked us the question, do you think MMR vaccines implicated in autism? He received the answer, yes, 6 times. No action followed that meeting in London. However, the public health bodies with the pharmaceutical industry went into publicity overdrive. The public were assaulted in the media with over 35 epidemiological studies from every which way: Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Japan. What the public health bodies omitted to tell the media or politicians was that epidemiology is not appropriate for establishing causation. Let me quote from the Lancet. Causal association cannot be established by data from observational research alone. And if the mechanism of a disease, if the mechanism is poorly understood, data from epidemiological research just cannot be used as the sole evidence to deny a causal link. The highly respected Cochrane Institute pitched in with the comment, the design and reporting of safety outcomes of MMR are inadequate. I'd like to illustrate this, I'll call it trickery, using epidemiology, with an example from the Scottish Parliament in 2001. A debate was called on single vaccines as a choice to MMR. Malcolm Chisholm, the then Deputy Health Minister, informed the Parliament that the MMR safety was confirmed by a Finnish study, which had followed up to 1.8 million children. And its conclusion was, no cases of autism were associated with MMR during this 14-year follow-up. The Finnish study is rightly infamous as an example of how epidemiology can be used or misused for deceptive purposes. In fact, only 187 children were tracked, not 1.8 million children, and when Heikki Peltola, the author of the Finnish study, was asked, was his study designed, this was on BBC, was your study designed to identify cases of autism? He replied, no. The study was irrelevant. The BMA and 5 Royal Colleges used that irrelevant study to mislead the Scottish public and this Parliament. In short, I get to this point, in short, the health bodies did not and still have not looked at the issue of a vaccine autism link. It has been deemed by the medical hierarchy that autistic spectrum disorder is solely genetic, and it is a solely genetic condition. I provided you, gentlemen, with a graph. Please look at the graph. It reveals the growing number of school children with an autism diagnosis over the last 25 years. It will reach a total of 250,000 school children in a few years' time. This is not genetics at work. The issue then entered a new phase, denial. better recognition was regularly wheeled out. Many of these children cannot talk or have severe communication problems. And what we are being told was that prior to 1990, doctors did not recognise that a child could not talk. Parents didn't recognise it. Teachers didn't recognise it. Since the very beginning, the public health bodies have demonstrated an entrenched reluctance to even contemplate that vaccination may be implicated in what we are witnessing. Changing diagnostic criteria, another favourite. Even though the changes in the diagnostic criteria were designed to reduce the numbers of children with being diagnosed, again, please look at the graph. Do you think that tinkering with the diagnosis would create the massive rise in autism that we are witnessing? Meantime, in the USA, in 2011, a robust and rigorous twin study was published, the CAT study, California Autism Twin Study. It concluded that at least 65% of autism is caused by an environmental factor. This revelation received no publicity. I decided to do my own research. I started with my grandson's MMR vaccine batch number. I then accessed the records from the MMR court case in London. I discovered that another 17 child litigants had the same vaccine batch number as my grandson. All were diagnosed autistic. I contacted a friend in Warrington and asked him to access his son's batch number, a different number, but the same story. 27 children had received that batch number. All were diagnosed autistic. I investigated the history of vaccine batch contamination, and I found important evidence in veterinary vaccines, where concerns have been raised for many years, recontamination with Mycoplasma fermentans, a contamination associated with cell culture technology. Mycoplasma fermentans is a bacterial pathogen. It is invisible to the naked eye. It lives within the host. It has an affinity to the cilia and the stereocilia, the small hairs that exist in all mammals. If Mycoplasma fermentans enters the body, it will lodge in an area of cilia, like the auditory tract, or the brainstem, or the gut. And from there, it will invade other cells and scavenge, causing gradual deterioration in the host. Please, I ask you, read my scientific paper. It's been peer-reviewed, it's been published. I then reread Leo Kanner, Dr. Leo Kanner's original research paper from 1943 in the USA, where he had identified the first 11 children with a new, very rare, I'm quoting Kanner, new and very rare condition, which he named autism. Interestingly, 7 of the children were thought to have been deaf. This is a very common feature in the children that we're seeing today. More interestingly, cell culture technology was introduced to vaccine manufacture in the USA in 1930, shortly before these children were born. Kanner's very rare autism is now more common than all other serious childhood conditions combined, following the introduction of a vaccine using cell culture technology, multiplied by 3, the MMR. Think synergy. Mycoplasma fermentans is difficult to detect. It does not remain in the blood. It is intracellular. It has no side walls, which makes it resistant to many antibiotics. And that is where the problem of quality control in vaccine manufacture probably began. My early hypothesis on the cause of regressive autism was placed on the internet by a parent. It was accessed quickly by parents in 45 countries worldwide. There's an awful lot of better recognition going on. I also contacted by email a number of universities. So far, only one has responded, and I'll read the response. I'm afraid the College of Medical, Veterinary and Life Sciences at the University of Glasgow has a strict set of research priorities. Your area of interest is not one of these. I wish you every success in your work. What set of research priorities in any civilized country ignores the cries of 250,000 sick children? In view of the attitude of public health to this tragedy affecting our children, I am requesting that the Scottish Government directly commission a research project and inform universities that funds will be made available. I estimate that my hypothesis can be tested using PCR and MSA tests on a sample of, say, 100 children at a total cost of under £100,000, with potential future savings to the government of billions of pounds. And the vaccination programme could be made safe at long last. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr Welsh. I mean, I certainly always feel at ease discussing these types of petitions because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a geneticist, and I'm relying basically on the...
I'm not a scientist either.
I'm relying on the scientific evidence that's available. Isn't you raised in your contributions the point that when someone put information up on the internet, it was accessed by people in 45 countries quite quickly. Do those 45 countries use the MMR vaccine?
It's a vaccination generally, because it's not, this isn't specifically MMR, it's mainly MMR, but there are other vaccines which are manufactured this way, using cell culture technology. But yes, the 45 countries will use the MMR vaccine. Yeah.
I'm just wondering then if what we're having here is a chicken and egg situation. Are people looking to try and establish that MMR is the cause of this, or is MMR the cause of this and people are looking for information around it? Is it not the case that the person who first made the link between MMR and autism has himself been discredited quite substantially in the work that he did, and therefore any link between MMR and the autism has been, you know, in scientific terms, been completely rejected?
No, they haven't looked at it. I'm sorry. The Dr. Wakefield, who was a chap who was discredited, as you put it, in actual fact, he visited this Parliament at my invitation and spoken, probably this room, to quite a number of MSPs. He has been struck off, he has been exiled, and he's been struck off and exiled because he mentioned the MMR in his research. But in actual fact, this is what I'm presenting to you is a different hypothesis altogether. I think Wakefield was actually a very decent man, but I think when the original court case in London took place, I don't think they went down the right route. I think the decisions were taken to go down a particular route when perhaps they should have stepped back, sat for a year, looked at it until they come up with something like my hypothesis, which answers all the questions which we may ask about how autism may be being created in our society. But it wasn't discredited. I mean, that's just part of the propaganda. If you mention, I'm telling you that the public health bodies have not looked at this issue, and our doctors won't look at it because they know what happened to Wakefield, as you know what happened to Wakefield, and they don't want it to happen to them.
I'll open it up to colleagues. Ken McIntosh, do you want to make a comment at the moment before we open it up to other members? I don't see any other indication from colleagues that they want to come in at this present time. But
Convener, thanks for the opportunity to join you this morning. Can I ask you, Bill, just is there any work going on in Scotland to try and understand the rise? There is a statistically measured rise, steep rise in the prevalence of autism in Scotland. What explanations are being offered for that, and is there any work or research underway currently to try and explain or understand that?
Well, the explanations being offered are mentioned in my little speech there, that better recognition, wider diagnostic criteria. These are all spurious excuses. You can't explain a rise like that. You cannot explain it without looking at environmental factors. And the problem we have, and the problem guys like me have, and parents have, is that the medical profession are determined to look at autism and put it in this genetic basket. It's in a box called genetics. And they seem to have incredible difficulty in accepting that it's now been proved in America that 65% of autism is not genetic. It's caused by an environmental factor. And then the fear arises that, oh gosh, we're back to the MMR again. But we never ever resolved the MMR issue. We looked at one hypothesis. And I spoke to Wakefield, and he said, and Dr. Wakefield said, mine is only one hypothesis. Well, here's another hypothesis. But I think, and maybe just me, but I think mine is more persuasive than Dr. Wakefield's was.
So can I ask, what do you think the committee should do and the Scottish Parliament should do to investigate further?
To try and find some way of getting the public health bodies to recognise there's a problem here. You've all got constituencies. You must know there's a problem. If you speak to schools, anybody in education, they know there's a problem, and parents will tell us a problem. But we cannot move the public health bodies through to say, well, look, there's a hypothesis, so let's examine, so let's look at this. Because I mention one word, I put one word in my hypothesis, and it closes all the doors. And that one word is vaccination. Apparently, vaccination is sacrosanct. You're not supposed to question vaccination. But I'm afraid if we're damaging thousands, hundreds of thousands of children, we really should be questioning whether the vaccination programme is implicated in this in some way, and seriously questioning it.
And do you think that autism is treatable?
I think if well, I've got to be very cautious about this answer, Ken. If my hypothesis is correct, and regressive autism, I use the word regressive all the time, regressive autism is caused by a bacterial infection, a contamination, then yes, it should be treatable. Certainly if you catch it very early, it should be treatable. I've been in contact with a pharmaceutical company in the United States, and I spoke to the owner of the company, and they are developing a macrolide, it's called. And I've been following this for a number of years, and I asked them if the macrolide they were developing would be effective against Mycoplasma fermentans, the contamination which I've identified. And they said, very effective. But they asked me to contact the scientist in Australia who was trialling it. And I contacted the scientist in Australia, and he said, yes, this is very effective against Mycoplasma fermentans. So the answer to your question is yes, I think this is treatable. For the children who have had this bacteria inside their body for the last 20 years or so, I'm not too sure how effective we can be there. But for children who start to regress into autism and we catch it early, yes, I think it could be 100% effective for them.
Any questions from colleagues, or we just have suggestions on how we take forward the petition?
Just
John?
one question for Mr. Welsh. Rather than trying to, and it's important that we try and resolve the problem that's already there and identified with children with autism, but what work should be being done to try and avoid the bacteria getting into the vaccination system in the first place and into the body?
Well, I think that my research in the United States, which I just mentioned, looking at the development of this macrolide, that is the answer for the vaccination manufacturers, because that macrolide, if it was added to their quality control, would eliminate any possibility of Mycoplasma fermentans being in the vaccine, in my understanding of the situation. Because this particular contaminant can't be 100% removed using the antibiotics that they use just now. So yes, in trying to help the children, I think we can also help the vaccination programme. I think that's important too, to make the vaccination programme safe.
Tackle if you're saying that it gets into the system through the vaccination process, then by actually tackling that process and making sure that we eliminate the bacteria before it gets into the vaccination system, that then we're not then having to do the follow-up work once it's been identified in individuals, once they're identified as having autism. Because it's trying to, I know what you're trying to do is get the pharmaceutical companies and governments to understand we should be doing everything we can to prevent the getting into the system, rather than dealing with it once it's already in the system.
That's absolutely correct. It shouldn't be in the system at all. And I think since 1930, it's been in the system in a small way. Now we probably have the means in the quality control part of manufacturing vaccines. We have the ability, I would think, to make that. In actual fact, that would, if the vaccine manufacturers were to look at that, then the rate of autism would descend, and we would have some sort of proof that was the cause in the first place. But the main drive, I was honorary president of a children's charity in Edinburgh for many years. The main drive that I focus on is trying to help the children who have been damaged, because the heartbreak involved in that is quite frankly unbearable at times. It's terrible when you see these kids, perfect kids, kids that could sing, kids that could talk, and can no longer do so, losing all their skills. And I think that's still the main drive for me.
I'll open up to colleagues to suggest what we do. I mean, I think the question is there any way we can get some scientific analysis of this? The best place to start is to talk to the scientists. So I think we need to talk to the Chief Scientific Officer and ask what the position is.
Because I was refused the audience from the Minister for Health, or a series of Ministers for Health, they kept diverting me, and one of the places they diverted me to was the Chief Scientific Officer. And it was one of the poorest and least successful interviews in 20 years of fighting this particular problem, because the chap hadn't even read my hypothesis. So I've lost confidence in an awful lot of the official bodies involved in this.
With all due respect, we're not asking him to review your work. I'm suggesting that we write to him and ask about what work needs to be done in order to take forward the petition, if it's possible to do that. It's not exactly the same question that you were asking. So.
No, I'm sorry, I can answer that question for you, because he told me I would have to get a university to make an application to him, that I, as an ordinary citizen, they didn't want to know about me. And I went to the universities, and I've read to you what the first reply I've had from a university. Well, no, it's not one of our priorities. How do we change that?
Well, so I'm trying to find a way of...
I know you're trying to help me, and
you're telling me not to do it. So I'm not sure that talking away...
I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm just saying my experience.
Right, in which case, then we'll do it then and see if we can get a different response to the committee than he might have done to a member of the public. We'll start from that point of view. Anyone else, Jackson? Do you want to?
A couple of suggestions, convener. Mr. Welsh has supplied a graph which extrapolates the incidence using a methodology in the United Kingdom. I would be interested to know if we could contact the Department of Health in the European Parliament to see what the emerging incidence is across other countries within the European Union, to see whether that is part of a similar pattern, because that may or may not validate the suggestion about extended diagnosis through different means, depending on the trend. Because if it is related in some way to the vaccine, then the trend ought to be absolutely parallel and not unique. Secondly, I noticed, obviously, the petitioner submitted a petition in March 2000, following which there was an expert group that at that point concluded that there wasn't sufficient evidence to support the hypothesized link between MR vaccine and autism. And I know this has been a subject of public discussion and concern over the years. That obviously now is at least, potentially up to 16 years ago, and I would be interested to know from the Scottish Government whether at any point they have sought to establish on an ongoing basis whether there is any further evidence or information that has been received which would allow a second expert group at some point to consider anything afresh, or whether in fact current practice simply relies upon the sort of views that were taken at that point.
Questions to ask of the government? Any other suggestions? Ken?
I'm not sure if I'm allowed to make suggestions, but...
Yeah, you can.
Can I suggest that rather than simply just asking for the chief scientists and the government's view on one hypothesis, either for or against, that we ask them what they're doing about the rise in autism and the prevalence of ASD, regressive autism, just to, and for them to say specifically, do they believe that this is simply a question of better diagnosis? It can be explained entirely by better diagnosis, and that there is, and further, are they conducting any research? Are they looking at this matter, putting aside, not putting aside, but not questioning the link with MMR or Bill's hypothesis, but are they conducting any other research themselves into this matter, or are they considering such?
It's entirely legitimate, yeah.
Probably worth asking that of the Department of Health then.
I would have
as well
thought
as
so,
the
yeah.
Scottish Health.
Okay. So there's a series of questions that we need to ask in relation to what you brought to us this morning, Mr Welsh. Thanks very much for bringing your petition. We'll collate the responses that we get and ask in relation to what you brought to us this morning, Mr Welsh. Thanks very much for bringing your petition. We'll collate the responses that we get and get them to you, and you can comment on them, and we'll take the petition forward once we have all that information gathered together. But thanks again this morning for coming in front of us.
Thank you very much
Thank you.
for inviting me. Thank you.
I'll suspend again for a couple of minutes till we